So Chip, as we mentioned, self-awareness is the first building block of emotional intelligence. And you mentioned you referred to Viktor Frankl and that you started with despair. How did those fit together and what did you come up with?
Yeah, I was listen, I was the CEO of a company that was in early 2008. I could sort of see the future coming and it didn't look good with the economy. And we were growing like gangbusters. Additionally, I didn't feel very good. I didn't feel very emotionally good in life. So I started reading Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl's landmark book about what it was like to live in a concentration camp and his basic belief as a psychologist that meaning is the fuel of life. And as I read that book, I started asking myself, gosh, this is the most profound book ever written on meaning. It's not a religious book. How do I make it practical? Where's the how-to part of this book? And of course that didn't exist. So the equation would be despair equals suffering minus meaning. So let me explain the math. So when you're in a state of difficult things going on, in Viktor Frankl's case, he was in a concentration camp. In your case, it could be a mental prison. And many of us as business leaders, especially if we're a CEO or a founder, feel in that mental prison. In fact, that's what's so great about Renaissance is it gives you the opportunity. You're all prisoners together.
Well, the feeling of being alone or
There's
being
a sense of
lonely at the
support
top.
group, being able to talk about it, and it's really valuable. There's something quite valuable in that kind of opportunity to connect with others. But for many of us, when we're going through a difficult time, it feels like all we can see is the suffering. So I started to believe, well, but what if suffering is a constant in life? If you're a Buddhist, it's actually the first noble truth of Buddhism. But it's sort of true when you're going through a hard time, as everything seems like everything is touched with that color of suffering. And yet there's this other thing that Frankl talked about, which is meaning. And he said that, you know, in fact, he has a very famous quote. He said, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. And what he was able to say is that how we respond to life, not react to life, but respond to life, is how we find our sense of meaning. And our sense of meaning comes from that sense of responsiveness. So the way the equation worked was if I saw suffering as a constant and meaning as a variable, if I increased the meaning, the despair went down. So just do the math. I mean, if the math is 7 equals 10 minus 3, so 7 is despair, 10 is suffering, and 3 is meaning. If 3 goes to 4, 7 goes to 6. So meaning and despair are inversely proportional to each other. Why is that important? It's sort of an abstract idea, but what it became relevant for me was to say, okay, on a weekly basis, I started doing a meaning index. I'd come to the end of the week, I'd make a list of what emotions I'd learned, and I said, okay, what am I learning from these emotions? And so it could be authenticity, humility, vulnerability, courage. How's that emotion going to serve me moving forward? And as I would ask that question and say, well, gosh, I felt very humbled this week by everything. So how's that serving me as opposed to not serving me? How is it next week, with respect to my humility, how am I going to use that as a powerful, positive leadership tool in my organization? Ultimately, 3 months later, I was feeling a lot better. This whole practice of doing this, and I was not in therapy. I was not reading any self-help books. I was just literally using my equation to get through it. And that was in August of 2008. November of 2008, I needed to do our annual leadership summit of our top 80 executives in the company. And I was supposed to get up and give a big speech, a cheerleading speech about how great 2009 was going to be, and I knew it wasn't. So I threw away this cheerleading speech I was going to do, and I decided to be vulnerable, which is one of those emotions I'd been feeling a lot the last 3 months. And I felt like if there's a group of people sitting in front of me who are suffering, and that the constant for them was suffering, how are we going to find the meaning in the next year, in 2009? And for the next hour, at an easel, I showed them the equation, and we had a conversation. And it reminded me of something I learned from Abe Maslow. So Abraham Maslow died in 1970. I was 10 years old. I never learned anything from him personally, but I was able to get his diaries. His family gave me his diaries for the last 10 years of his life. And one of the things he wrote about in his diaries was the idea of psychohygiene. He said, great leaders and great companies create great psychohygiene. What does that word mean, the hyphenated word psychohygiene? What it meant was that when you're going through a really difficult time as an organization and as a leader, the best thing you can do is help your employees and your team bathe together. And when I say bathe together, I'm not talking about literally. I'm talking about figuratively. Create an experience for them to have a catharsis. Create an experience for them to have, in the sweat box that can be a difficult environment at work, give them the sense that they're showering together. The idea that we are getting clean and we are feeling like we're not having to sort of hold up our armor and protect ourselves. And in that hour, we did that. And 80 executives in the company sat around talking with each other and hearing me and talking with the whole group about how they were going to find meaning in 2009. An hour later, it was shocking how powerful the experience was. And some people came up to me and whispered to me and said, I like that equation, that despair equals suffering minus meaning. Do you have an equation for jealousy? And someone asked about happiness, and then someone asked about anxiety.
Not for them, of course, for someone else,
yes,
I'm sure.
of course, someone else. And interestingly, it was men. It was the three people who came up individually with three different men. So the men seemed to be resonating with these equations. Because the truth is, actually, we as men have, in some ways, not as much experience dealing with our emotions as women. And so they liked the idea of the equations, and that led me to deciding, okay, I want to go and learn more about these emotional equations.
So when you say not as much experience, what I'm picturing is we maybe see primary colors. I mean, we certainly have the emotions. It's not like we don't have them.
Yeah.
We just have a hard time maybe explaining them. We don't see those secondary colors on the wheel like Plutchik found.
Yeah, it goes back to childhood. I mean, the environment that women are in, young girls are in, and the environment of how they're brought up is much more about, how do you build your emotional repertoire of skills. So how do you be an emotional mathematician as a girl or as a woman. Guys, you're right. It's more primary colors. There's less subtleties, and it's more about being strong. And if you're not feeling the strength, you just sort of still try to at least look strong.